Rachel Holt for NESN.com alongside Ryan Fowler of Fox Sports. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
You got it.
All right, we're in week 4 of the NFL season, and there's a lot of fantasy football questions, as always, but this week especially because it's a bye week, and you're not getting the Green Bay Packers or you're not getting the Philadelphia Eagles. So if you have players on either of those two teams, you need to make some moves this week. First, let's get into that. Who do we replace? We're talking big names like Aaron Rodgers and Carson Wentz and people that have been putting up a lot of points. So first, in the quarterback position, who are we targeting on week 4?
Well, yeah, you know, it's funny with the Carson Wentz thing. We were just starting to get to know him, and then we have a week 4 bye week. I don't think too many people were starting Carson Wentz through the first 3 weeks. They needed to see a little bit more, and I think that Steelers game, I mean, when you're beating up the Steelers as bad as he did, I know the Steelers defense isn't that great. I think Carson Wentz has had his hello NFL moment, so we'll see how he does coming out after the bye. I think a lot of people will be picking him up, stashing him going forward, plus he'll get Zach Ertz back next week, and I think that's a fine move. And then, of course, you mentioned Aaron Rodgers. That's going to be a huge hole to fill this early in the season. I still think this week 4 bye week's a little early, but again, I didn't play in the preseason either. So I think what we do now is we take a look at Kirk Cousins. I mean, attack the Browns defense, right? I mean, this isn't too difficult. I think right now, Kirk Cousins and Jamison Crowder, two guys floating on the waiver wire, is the top target this week because, again, Ryan Tannehill, he didn't look great against the Browns, but he put up some big numbers. And right now, the Browns defense, you can chew that up. Plus, again, Jamison Crowder, I talked about this on Sunday night in a video recap at Fox. Jamison Crowder is averaging better than 15 fantasy points per game in PPR leagues. That's quality production, it's consistent production, and I think all the Redskins can have a big day at home against the Browns in week 4.
Okay, you also had this great article on Fox Sports where you talked about some of the unlikely guys that broke out in week 3, and Trevor Siemian was one of them, and he's not owned in a lot of leagues. Is this someone that we can rely on moving forward to put up some big points?
Rely on's a strong word. I think Trevor Siemian, I think when you go into Cincinnati, I think Cincinnati's MO was to stop C.J. Anderson. C.J. Anderson had been playing some good football and helping out fantasy owners in the process. Plus, I don't know if you saw the narrative. It's a story. And here's the thing. Narratives get bad press these days. Nobody likes the narrative. They used to like the narrative when storytelling in football and in sports was the MO. Now we got to get too deep into the weeds so we're not insulting anybody's intelligence. But the narrative was that Trevor Siemian wasn't passing enough to his wide receivers, Emmanuel Sanders, Demaryius Thomas, and the cast of characters there with Denver. So what does he do? He chucks it all over the yard and goes off for some monster fantasy points. Again, anytime you get over 25 fantasy points among your fantasy quarterbacks, you're doing well, you're living life well in the fantasy world. He had 30-plus fantasy points in most leagues. So Trevor Siemian, I think we got to pump the brakes a little bit on how well he's going to do moving forward because, again, C.J. Anderson is the top offensive weapon currently, only based on, again, they needed to see what they had with Siemian. I think the Bengals' MO was to stop C.J. Anderson, so that allowed Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas to have big games. I'm not ready to put Trevor Siemian in the top 12 quite yet.
Okay, another thing that we have a lot of questions on, obviously with the bye week and injuries that we're dealing with, running backs are scarce, a good running back. So in terms of who you're looking at to have a great week 4, what are some names?
Great week 4 might be a stretch, Rachel, because right now, after coming, and you talked to John last week, when you look at the week 2 injury report going into week 3, I mean, it was a mess. I mean, look at the running back by committees around the league. Minnesota, Jerick McKinnon, Matt Asiata. Look at Detroit. Dwayne Washington's going to get some more burn this week. So we'll circle back to that because Theo Riddick, he's still that PPR option. You go down to Tampa Bay. Charles Sims had a nice game, not a great game, but Doug Martin will be back. You look at what's going on with the New York Giants. Shane Vereen out for most of the season, placed on IR. He might be able to come back. But then you have Orleans Darkwa, and you got a young team there in the backfield. So a lot of running back by committees. I think the big name that's going to come off the waiver wire this week is Jordan Howard for the Chicago Bears. I looked at the trends overnight, and this is early on. Jordan Howard moved up to 5% ownership on foxsports.com. And again, most waivers clear Wednesday and Thursday, so that ownership percentage should jump over 50% because Jeremy Langford's going to be out 4 to 6 weeks, according to a report. And again, a lot of running back by committees. I don't think Jordan Howard is going to be able to do it by himself in Chicago. Plus, you have to consider the Bears' defense. they're going to be passing a lot in the second half. But I think Jordan Howard is going to be the name brand to keep an eye on. And then circling back to Dwayne Washington, when Amir Abdullah went out, I picked up Dwayne Washington in a couple leagues because I thought, Theo Riddick's a great running back in PPR formats, and he can do some things in the passing game. But between the tackles, they need to see what they have in Dwayne Washington, because that's what Amir Abdullah was doing. He was between the tackles, and then Theo did it outside on the screen pass and run. And I think that's what we're going to see moving forward. So the big names this week, Dwayne Washington, Jordan Howard, and then, Kristen Michael, even when Thomas Rawls comes back or is healthy enough to play, I think Kristen Michael proved that he needs a heavier workload, and that was one of the big handcuffs that a lot of people said, keep an eye on Michael in draft season, because if Thomas Rawls can't get to 100%, which he hasn't been able to do yet, Kristen Michael, big game against the 49ers in week 3.
Okay, obviously when you're picking up some of these guys that are question marks still for your league, you have to make some moves on your roster, and unfortunately you have to drop guys, trade them away. And one of the guys that you mentioned is Jeremy Langford as a running back who really hasn't been producing and not entirely healthy at this point. Is he one of the guys, and who are some of the other guys that you can get rid of and feel good about it?
Yeah, well, the one thing, I host a chat on Monday night at foxsports.com/fantasy, and the chat kind of goes along these lines. Who can I drop and feel confident picking up X, Y, or Z? And the thing is, with running backs right now, I don't know if you want to drop any of them, because on any given week, you need that running back depth. I think where you have to look at dropping people are your second tight end, your second quarterback. I don't think you need to be carrying 2 quarterbacks week to week, because the running back depth that you have is going to help you moving forward. Every week this far, weeks 1, 2, and 3, we've lost quality running backs, and I think having that depth, and that's why I'm telling people to go out and look at Kenneth Dixon of the Baltimore Ravens. He's rehabbing from an MCL injury from the preseason. Kenneth Dixon is going to be part of that puzzle in Baltimore, because Justin Forsett and Terrence West haven't gotten the job done, and I think he's going to get some looks when he returns. Down in Miami, Kenyon Drake and JIG, I just don't see it. If you want to drop Kenyon Drake and JIG, go for it, because Arian Foster might not be healthy, but look at the metric. You referenced that article that I wrote on Sunday, which kind of recapped the running back by committees. It's the lead running backs in those situations aren't putting up enough points to say confidently, he's my RB1, he's my RB2. I think that on the waiver wire and looking through the future of like a guy like Kenneth Dixon is the way to go. I think right now you really need to hold on to those running back assets. There aren't enough handcuffs in the world to prepare you for what's next, and that's kind of the MO coming out of all these running back injuries.
Okay, obviously a lot of questions about the running backs here. Any wide receivers that you're targeting this week in the waiver wire?
Yeah, I mentioned Crowder. I think Crowder will be a big one. And then the other guy that I highlighted in that piece was Quincy Enunwa. Brandon Marshall barely made it to that game against the Chiefs, in which Ryan Fitzpatrick threw 6 interceptions. Brandon Marshall's dealing with a knee injury. And Eric Decker, first game in the past 7 games where he didn't score a touchdown. He was Mr. Consistent. Sometimes the numbers aren't out of this world like he did against Buffalo, but he was scoring touchdowns week in and week out, and he didn't do that against the Chiefs, just the 1 catch for 31 yards. So Quincy Enunwa was very intriguing. 11 targets in that game against the Chiefs, and if you look at his first 3 games, he's part of the mix, and I think that's because they're hounding Brandon Marshall and they're hounding Eric Decker to try and slow them down. So Quincy Enunwa has had a pretty good start to the season. He's somebody I keep an eye on. Now, somebody asked me in the chat last night, what about Austin Seferian-Jenkins coming to town? I don't think that's going to take away from Enunwa. Austin Seferian-Jenkins has not earned the benefit of the doubt. Left Tampa Bay under bad circumstances, off the field incident, and he almost didn't make the 53-man roster to begin with. He had a strong end of camp. So Enunwa, I really think he's the one. And people were asking me, should I drop Tajay Sharp? Tajay Sharp of the Tennessee Titans had that monster first week, heavy volume of targets. Last few games has kind of struggled. I still think, based on the way that he finished that game against the Raiders, he was targeted a bunch. I don't think Marcus Mariota has looked away from him yet. I just think DeMarco Murray's run really well, and at some point that's going to slow up and they're going to have to get Sharp involved.
Okay, now I have to ask you, aside from the individual players, a lot of us play survivor leagues, and we pick one team each week to win. And it's been very difficult up until this point. There really hasn't been an easy match. For instance, in week 3, a lot of people targeted that Dolphins and Browns game, and everyone thought that was a lock with the Dolphins going to win. Well, it If it wasn't for a missed field goal from the Browns, and of course it went into OT and it gave us all a scare, those that picked the Dolphins, it's not fun to be in these Survivor Leagues and feel like you're just on the verge of losing. In terms of Week 4 teams and matchups, are there any that you're looking at that look like a safe bet at this point?
Ooh, safe bet. I think what you kind of just summed up of that Dolphins and Browns game is kind of the microcosm of what Survivor pools are. Because again, you go back to Week 1, the Dolphins competed against the Seahawks, the same Seahawks team that just blew out the 49ers. So I think we have to be careful on how we phrase sure thing, but go after the Browns again. I really think the Redskins have this thing locked up. I think they have enough offense to really chew up that Browns secondary, plus they're playing at home. I know the Browns were on the road last week, but now there's tape on Cody Kessler. There really wasn't that much tape on Cody Kessler, and if you slow down Terrell Pryor, who I do think should be a waiver wire target, I don't know if he should start every week, but you can't ignore 8 receptions and 144 yards. But yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. I think that there's something to be said of the different ways they're getting Pryor involved. But that's the matchup. I mean, you look at the Bears, and they're still, yikes. But the Lions, they didn't look so crisp at the beginning of the game against the Packers. I think and you don't like to take road teams in Survivor this early in the season. I think the Bears at any moment could really pop up and shock somebody like the Browns did last week. So, I mean, you could beat up on these 0-3 teams, but I think it's easiest to look at the Browns and say, this isn't a team in a position to win week to week. And the Redskins, especially with the way that they played for most of the game against the Giants, that's a team in a position to keep moving forward, and that's where I'm looking at. Washington, plus, again, with the way Washington's schedule shakes out with that division, you're not going to get too many chances to pick up Washington as a Survivor pick. I think it's the way to go.
Everything gets a little more difficult in these bye weeks, even in Survivor Leagues, so it should be an interesting week moving forward. Any other last-minute advice you have for fantasy owners going into Week 4?
Yeah, stay patient. I got a lot of tweets about Kelvin Benjamin. He struggled against the Vikings. Hey, newsflash, the Vikings defense is pretty good, and Kelvin Benjamin's not going to be a week in and week out superstar. He's going to be consistent throughout the 16-game schedule. I think he's going to have these moments where, the Vikings defense, they are what they are. Mike Zimmer did it in Cincinnati before he got to Minnesota. This is going to happen. And then Julio Jones, I think that's the biggest head scratcher. New Orleans' MO was probably stop Julio Jones, let everybody beat us. And they did, because Devonta Freeman and Tevin Coleman, they had some monster games on Monday night, but I wouldn't worry about Julio Jones. I know he entered that game with a little bit of an injury concern. But yeah, for those that gave up on Devonta Freeman, don't. And I think if you're worried that Tevin Coleman is a vulture, embrace that he is, because I think that they can coexist. The analogy I used on a radio interview this morning was Devonta Freeman and Tevin Coleman in Atlanta, that RBBC, can be like D'Angelo Williams and Jonathan Stewart a few years ago when they were both in Carolina. They both can help your team, and I think Tevin Coleman proved last year that he was going to be a viable option, and it's just kind of a little bit of a heartbreak for Devonta Freeman owners who thought, oh, he's going to do exactly what he did in 2015. They said, the Falcons offensive coordinator said, they were going to do this committee. They've backed it up, and it's worked out for them so far. I would not worry too much about those guys.
Okay, I do have one more question. You reminded me of something. A lot of people do pick up defenses based on the matchups this week. So if you did have to target a defense this week, who would you look at?
Who would you think I would suggest after what we've just talked about?
You're going after everyone who's playing the Browns, aren't you?
Exactly. Prove me wrong. The Dolphins stream wouldn't have worked out, but I think that the Redskins stream can. Cody Kessler, we didn't have much tape on him outside of what we had in the preseason. I think beating up on that team, and then again, maybe the Lions, I think against that. Here's the thing. The good fantasy defenses are taken. I mean, the cream of the crop are taken. The Chiefs go out there, and they're already owned, and they pick up 35 fantasy points. I think streaming defenses can get you in trouble sometimes because you overthink the room. But if you are doing that, and I highly suggest not doing that, I think Washington's going to be the pick this week, just because, again, the Browns, they're going to struggle to score points more often than not. And when you look around the rest of the league based on some of these matchups, either the defense that you want is owned in a tasty matchup, or that there's going to be some points scored in that game.
Okay, this has all been great stuff. Thanks for helping us out. Like I said, lots of questions going into this week, so it's not going to be an easy one for anyone. Ryan, where can we find more from you?
Yeah, at Fox Sports Fowler on Twitter. I answer all the questions. Hit me up anytime there. And then foxsports.com/fantasy. We'll get you ready for Week 4.
Okay, thanks so much. We look forward to talking to you in week 6.